The origin of humanity, the world, before human beings, long before human beings existed, the Earth had already lived almost all of its history. For over 4 billion years, the planet slowly transformed, shaped by forces that had no intention or consciousness, but unknowingly prepared it. The stage is set for something completely new. The early Earth was a hostile world. Its atmosphere lacked breathable oxygen. The volcanoes dominated the landscape, releasing toxic gases. The oceans were hot and acidic. There were no forests, no animals, and no blue sky. However, in that extreme environment, the first spark of life emerged. More than 3.5 billion years ago, microscopic organisms appeared that were capable of reproducing and adapting. Over millions of generations, these simple life forms began to modify the planet. Some learned to use the sun's energy, releasing oxygen as a waste product. That oxygen, initially poisonous to existing life, ended up changing the atmosphere and making a new evolutionary stage possible. Over hundreds of millions of years, life became more complex. Multicellular organisms emerged, then marine animals. Later plants that colonized the mainland. The planet was covered with jungles, swamps and vast green expanses. Giant reptiles, primitive birds, and small mammals appeared, surviving in the shadows of a world dominated by giants. But evolution was not a smooth process. The Earth suffered mass extinctions that wiped most of the species that had existed off the map. Meteorites, extreme climate changes and geological transformations wiped out entire worlds of life. Every catastrophe was simultaneously an end and an opportunity. After the extinction of the large reptiles, mammals began to expand, adapted to different climates, and developed more complex brains and more elaborate social behaviors in the forests and savannas of Africa. Some of these mammals began to change decisively. The African climate became drier and more unstable. The jungles receded and gave way to vast savannas. This change forced certain primates to descend from the trees and face an open environment, full of new dangers and opportunities. It was no longer enough to just climb. It was necessary to walk, observe the horizon, and anticipate threats. In that context, a key transformation emerged. Bipedalism, walking on two legs, freed the hands, reduced exposure to the sun, and allowed people to travel long distances with less energy expenditure. It wasn't an immediate change, nor was it perfect. For hundreds of thousands of years, these beings walked clumsily in Triridus mundus, neither completely arboreal nor fully terrestrial. At the same time, the brain began to grow slowly, not out of an abstract need to think, but out of the pressure to survive. Remembering roots, recognizing edible plants, interpreting gestures within the group, anticipating the behavior of predators. Every small cognitive advance offered an advantage. Cooperation became essential. Groups that shared food, protected their young, and learned from each other had a greater chance of survival. Evolution began to favor not only physical strength, but the ability to communicate, to learn and to transmit knowledge before any complex language, before any elaborate tool. Something fundamental already existed: awareness of the environment, the ability to observe, remember, and adapt. They were not yet human beings, but they were no longer mere animals. This world before humankind was not a void waiting to be filled. It was a long, patient and deeply complex process. Every climate change, every genetic mutation, every extinction, and every adaptation built the necessary conditions for a new form of life to appear millions of years later, capable of questioning its own origin. Human beings did not appear suddenly. It was the result of a living, changing, and often relentless planet. Before history existed, before culture, before written memory, something different was already brewing, the birth of the first hominid. For millions of years, the world was already alive before humans, but something began to change. Silently and profoundly in East Africa, between 7 and 6 million years ago, the planet's climate began to transform. Large tropical rainforests were fragmented. The dense forests receded. Instead, open savanna emerged, mixed areas of trees and grasslands. With increasingly marked dry seasons, this environmental change was not an immediate catastrophe. It was a slow, constant pressure that forced some primates to adapt or disappear. The evolutionary turning point, the ancient primates, were designed to live in trees, hands for grasping, prey feet. Light bodies, but in the savanna, the trees were more spread out. Some individuals began to descend to the ground more frequently. Not to abandon the trees altogether, but to travel longer distances in search of food. This is where the first great evolutionary leap occurred. Walking upright on two legs occasionally offered decisive advantages. Seeing predators at a distance frees up hands to carry food, reducing direct exposure to the sun. Bipedalism was not a conscious decision, it was a biological response to the environment. The earliest known hominids, the oldest fossil remains related to this transition, belong to several early species, including Sahelanthropus chadensis, Orontugenensis, Ardipithecus ramidus. These species were not human, but they were no longer mere apes. They had small brains, similar to modern chimpanzees, but their bones reveal something new, a more upright posture, a pelvis adapted to walking upright, a unique combination of arboreal and terrestrial traits. The human lineage had begun with Ardipithecus, the walker. Between two worlds, one of the most revealing discoveries was Ardipithecus ramidus, with more than 4.4 million years of history. This hominid could walk upright, but still climb trees with ease. His feet were not like ours. His big toe was separated, adapted to grip branches, but his pelvis was already showing clear changes towards bipedalism. Ardipithecus lived in a mixed environment. Open woodlands, scrubland, and early savanna. This demonstrates something key. Human evolution did not begin in the open savanna as was believed for decades. It began in intermediate, changing, unstable landscapes. The body changes before the mind. A fundamental point that breaks many myths. The brain was not the first thing to grow. For millions of years hominids walked upright, with small brains and limited cognitive abilities. The initial transformation was physical, not intellectual. Walking upright changed everything. The way you breathe, the position of your head, the structure of your spine, your body's balance. This new body opened the door to future changes, more complex use of tools, better communication, more advanced social organization, but that was still a long way off. It wasn't just one species. Another common mistake is thinking that there was a first in it and then humans. The reality was much more complex. For millions of years, several homin species coexisted at the same time in different regions of Africa. Some prospered, others disappeared. Human evolution was not a ladder, it was a tree with many branches. And on that tree, most of the branches died. The birth of a single line from all those early species, only one line continued to develop steadily. That line would later give rise to the Australopithecines and much later to the Homin genus. But at this point in history, nobody could have foreseen it. The first Hominid did not know that he was beginning the history of humanity. He was just surviving, walking among scattered trees, looking at the horizon for the first time, adapting to a world that would never be the same again. The birth of the human lineage. For millions of years, Earth had been a stage dominated by natural forces, extreme climate changes, and creatures that adapted or disappeared. But in that long process, something began to differentiate certain hominids from the rest of living beings. It wasn't just one event, it wasn't just one place. It was a slow and profound convergence of biological, environmental, and behavioral factors. The first hominids who walked upright were not humans as we know them today. They were fragile beings, exposed to predators, with small brains and limited capabilities. However, they possessed something that would mark the destiny of the planet, the possibility of changing their way of life. Instead of passively adapting to the environment, standing upright freed the hands. The hands-free design allowed for the manipulation of objects. Manipulation led to the creation of tools. The first carved stones were not sophisticated weapons, but extensions of the body. They were used to cut meat, break bones, and access energy-rich marrow. This access to new foods slowly transformed metabolism and brain development. The brain began to grow not explosively, but steadily. Each generation inherited small improvements, greater learning capacity, better memory, greater social coordination. Here arises one of the most decisive traits of the human lineage: cooperation. The hominins who survived were not necessarily the strongest, but those who learned to live in groups, share food, warn of danger, care for each other's offspring, and pass on experience. Survival ceased to be individual and became collective. At that point, communication began to transform. Gestures, sounds, glances, and simple rituals allowed for the coordination of actions. Language did not yet exist, but the intention to communicate ideas already existed. Over time, some species of hominids mastered fire. This breakthrough changed everything. Fire made it possible to cook food, eliminating parasites and facilitating digestion. It allowed people to live in cold regions, to meet at night, to extend interaction time, and to strengthen social bonds. Something new was born around the fire: cultural transmission. Knowledge no longer depended solely on genetics. They were taught, imitated, and perfected. Learning outpaced biological evolution. Meanwhile, different human species coexisted in Africa, Asia, Europe, and America. Some became extinct, others mixed together. Human lineage was not a straight line, but a tree with many branches. From that tree would eventually emerge modern humans, Homo sapiens, not as a sudden creation, but as the result of millions of years of trial, error, adaptation, and shared memory. The true birth of humanity was not physical, it was mental. When an ape was able to imagine the future, when it was able to remember the past, when it was able to recognize itself as part of a group and a history, that's where it all began. In the next series of documentaries, we will explore how that early human being spread across the planet, what happened with the other human species, and what traces remain alive within us today, because the origin of humanity is not buried in the past. Keep walking with us. This documentary is part of a saga. You can find the following chapters on this channel. Let's rewrite our history.